Today, obviously, we are welcoming you here to discuss Hyperconverged. We're going to go through a few different aspects of it. We're going to start out by discussing kind of a little bit of the differences between a three-tiered architecture and how we move into a hyperconverged architecture. We're going to talk about a workload and a customer case where we found some good success implementing HCI. Then we're going to talk about some, secondary and tertiary workloads that can also work on HCI. We're going to talk about some of the financials, TCO, and ROI that come with moving into a hyperconverged infrastructure. And then we're going to talk about how CDW, our architects on both services side of our strategic solutions practice, can help you guys implement this. So with that said, I am going to hand it off to Pedro to discuss the move from three-tiered to HCI.
Thanks, John. So our typical environment usually will look like the left side of the screen here, which is a bunch of servers, some network switches, and a storage layer being a SAN or an AS. And typically this has worked for most of our customers and most of you who probably use this as your traditional environment. But there's also a new way of looking at things, and that's looking at the hyperconverged model. Some of you are wondering, why would we want to move to hyperconverged? What are the benefits, and what's that going to do for me as a customer? So first off, it's going to give you the ability to manage this environment much more simply, giving you the ability to do one-click management, having one pane of glass as your management console. So versus your traditional environment where you have one pane of glass for the server side of things, one pane of glass for your storage, and then one for the networking side, that brings a lot of different resources in to manage that and a little bit more complexity. Whereas on the hyperconverged side, we have one pane of glass that allows you to do all those different functions, as well as other things as far as managing the environment and the analytics side of things. Another great benefit is that it's all software defined, so we have software running all the different layers versus having to depend on all the physical pieces of it. So having the server and storage all built into one box and having a virtual layer managing it brings in, again, that simplicity of having one hypervisor and the management built together. Commodity hardware is what this is all based on and predicated. We have your generic x86 servers running everything and the storage piece. The ease of scalability, being able to add a node on the fly as the demands are required. So for one of the types of use cases, when you have a lot of users being added on and a company growing, you can easily deploy another node and add more VMs as required, whereas traditionally you'd have to deploy another host and add more storage, which brings in more complexity. So having the ease of scalability, one click to add a node, within a few minutes you've got an extra node running, and brings in the simplicity there again. The single pane of glass management, being able to do everything from one screen removes the requirement to have different administrators from the storage side, networking side, and server side. You'd be able to do everything from that one pane of glass, managing that environment, deploying VMs, creating the pools of resources that are required to run this environment. One of the bigger things here that could help towards the TCO is the reduction in power and cooling as well. Just think of a server room full of servers, networking, switches, and storage, and reducing that down to maybe a 3 or 4 node cluster. That could take up to maybe 12 U on that one rack. So that reduces a lot of the physical infrastructure required. Again, reducing the amount of power and cooling, putting more money back in your pockets. The refresh cycle here as well is not as demanding as in your traditional environment. Not all customers have their server and storage come up for refresh at the same time, so that does require more work as far as being able to change over those servers when their 3 or 5 year cycle comes up. Same thing with the storage. With the nodes, as we require nodes, we'll add more nodes. If we don't need nodes, we can remove a node depending on how your environment is growing or being reduced. The better TCO and ROI, and John will talk a little bit more about this later, but we can get your return on investments within 5 years and show how that can actually benefit you from, you know, the higher initial costs, but the overall operating costs will be reduced. And we'll just quickly talk about the support structure here, which is one thing that a lot of customers do tend to find is a big hassle, and what it comes down to is with Hyperconverged, there's one phone number to call, there's one email, and that's it. We don't have to call different vendors for different situations, or you know, when we need support for our servers, we have to call one number, network is another number, and storage is another number, and those can create a lot of complexity and finger pointing. So when we look at Hyperconverged, that's one phone number, we call that one support line, and they'll be able to help you. So with all that, we'll move into one of the main workloads that you know, Hyperconverged has been based off of, which is the virtual desktop infrastructure, and John will talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Pedro. And just one thing to kind of add, just to go on to how Pedro discussed the differences between three-tiered architecture and HCI architecture is obviously we're looking at a stark difference in how it's built from a hardware perspective, but it isn't the same old game that we were looking at before when we're looking at a three-tiered new hardware brings new capabilities and brings different kind of modalities. What we're looking at is very much a different way in how we're running our infrastructure. So if we kind of reference back to everything that Pedro just explained, those are all very different ways in how we're running it from whether it's a purely technical point of view, or if it's a support structure, or if it's even addressing human resources towards that infrastructure. So I just want to kind of keep that in mind. But yes, as Pedro said, we're going to kind of move into a customer situation that I had dealt with regarding HCI and VDI. So just to frame it a little bit for you guys out there, this was for a customer that's a large health organization in Toronto. So they came to CDW with an issue, or I guess an opportunity, and they said that they needed to find something to run their VDI. They needed to roll out a VDI infrastructure that was over 1,000 users, and they needed something that would exist somewhat in its own, so they didn't have any kind of performance degradation, but they wanted something that was tuned towards VDI. So I'm sure if you guys are familiar with HCI at all, VDI is often that first stepping stone into the world of HCI, and there's a few reasons for that. So I've noted them here that the three biggest things that I look at when we're vetting a VDI opportunity is we need to find something that will give provisioning times that are applicable for the customer, that are not going to make you wait when you need to expand at different instances. We need efficiencies through logon storms. So especially when we're scaling out into larger environments, if everybody's trying to log it at once and then we're having hardware bottlenecks, that's not going to be good for your business. That's not going to be good for your organization. It's not going to be good for anyone. And then lastly, we need resiliency and performance sustainability. So just to kind of circle back to how this specific opportunity kind of went around, they were a VMware customer with Microsoft. So they wanted to put VMware Horizon onto a hardware. So that saved us the whole step of trying to vet the actual VDI solution. They had an existing VDI solution, but they were having the three issues that I explained previously. And they came to CDW to say, hey, how can we implement this? How can we design it? So firstly, we looked at provisioning times. So how does HCI help customers with provisioning times for VDI? Well, as Pedro mentioned when he was discussing the tenets of HCI, we see that it is a scalable architecture. We can scale up, we can scale out, we can scale back. Scaling back is usually not something we do, but sometimes organizations shrink and we no longer need to provision that compute. We no longer need to provision that storage to our VDI clusters. But in anything, when a new department starts, if we have new employees starting, when there was new people starting at the hospital, they needed to have something up and running. They needed to be able to provision the resources for that virtual desktop instance without any downtime, because they needed things to get moving. In the healthcare industry, things can't just stop. We can't just wait, although I know we've all probably experienced some pretty crazy wait times at a hospital, but in the back end, we can't have things just slowing down. So with HCI, we're able to just scale out, and we're able to allocate those resources in a cloud-like infrastructure in your own private data center to make sure that we can provision virtual desktop interfaces at the drop of a hat within minutes as opposed to days or hours when we're looking at a three-tiered architecture, because sometimes the customer said that they were finding that, and then all of a sudden they were finding a bottleneck in their network. They were finding a bottleneck in their compute. They were running out of storage, which was making it have performance degradations onto their controllers, and they need to do a forklift upgrade, and they need to provision, they needed to plan these things months in advance, and sometimes they didn't really have that warning, because, you know, some other departments say, hey, we're hiring all these people. So that was something that really caught the customer's eye. So moving on to the efficiencies through log-on storms. So essentially, we all understand what a log-on storm is. That's everybody trying to log in at once. In the healthcare industry, there was still a huge issue with this, but if we're looking at a more traditional organization where, you know, people are starting at 9, they're leaving at 5, everybody logging on in the morning, we don't want people sitting there waiting an extra 10, 15, 20 minutes to start their day because they're waiting for their virtual infrastructure to store. So again, it comes back to the flexibility, the scalability of it. With those log-on storms, we're able to scale out and assign more resources to particular virtual machines and virtual desktop interfaces to make sure that we're not having those bottlenecks, and we're not having that performance degradation. Because again, if we have those and those log-on storms keep everyone back, then it's going to affect the business in more ways than just from an IT perspective. Lastly, we looked at resiliency and performance sustainability. So when we are able to have an HCI solution that is sized correctly, we have an N-1 fault tolerance. So essentially a little bit different than how we would have in a three-tiered architecture where most of our fault tolerance is based off from a disk level. We're basing it off of a node level for most of our vendors from a hyper-converged perspective. We'll get into that a little bit later, that some of them kind of have interesting ways of doing this, some augmentations to that, but for all intents and purposes, for this example, we'll think about it as an N-1. So what that means is that if we understand that a hyper-converged infrastructure is going to run off of writing the same data to a series of nodes in a way that we are fully redundant, we want to be able to lose at least one node and have no performance degradation and have no data loss. So when we scaled this situation out, we had it so it was a 5-node cluster. If we're looking at the entry point for most of our customers, we do a 3-node cluster to get that same N-1 redundancy. And with that, we were able to ensure to the customer that an entire node could go down with each disk inside there. And in this case, we were looking at an all-flash solution. So as we know, all-flash SSDs, they don't fail. They usually wear out before we see any failing or corruption. So we were able to kind of give the customer a peace of mind on that, and they were able to know that in their production environment for their VDI infrastructure, they were able to use one node. Furthermore, we added 2 of those nodes to make sure that we had a redundant cluster, so to speak. So that was to make sure we had strategic kind of priority virtual desktop interfaces to be able to make sure that those were always going to be up and running, that, you know, critical workloads that needed that virtual desktop interface weren't just going to go down in the event that there was some sort of disaster, and that was coupled with their existing DR policy. So all in all, just to kind of bring it back, there's a lot of tenets that are specific to HCI that make a great use case for VDI. It's very difficult to mimic a lot of the points that I discussed with a traditional 3-tiered architecture without dropping an insane amount of capital in it and an insane amount of administrative costs in terms of the human capital needed to kind of run that and get the same automation. So again, just to kind of bring that back to my original point, we see that there's differences in how the customer was able to manage it when they bought the HCI solution for their VDI, there was a lot more automation, there was a lot more planning, and there was an ease of management to it, whereas it could have been a very complex and costly endeavor in terms of time, but we were able to, not only with our design but also our implementation, kind of put it with ease for the customer and find a solution that we think works very well. And talking to this customer a few months after it's been implemented, we've heard nothing but rave reviews, and it's one of the most lucrative workloads that we see for HCI. So with that said, VDI is not the only workload that works for HCI, so I'm going to pass it back to Pedro, and he's going to discuss some of the other workloads that we've seen some success with hyperconverged infrastructure.
Thanks, John. So the first one I want to highlight quickly is video surveillance. This may not be everybody's type of workload, but it is one of the bigger workloads out there that you can run an HCI solution on. And the reason we want to do this is because it builds in a lot of the resiliency and availability for some of those critical videos that need to be stored. So the big key here is having the availability, and we all know that sometimes storage devices can have failures or issues, but being on a hyperconverged solution, we have a lot of that redundancy built in there, so it keeps that surveillance video, the critical videos up and without any loss. And a good example of a customer that would look at video surveillance is our local airport, our malls, anywhere that would require a lot of surveillance cameras. And the good example here is Pearson International Airport has deployed over, I think, 10,000 cameras, and they're all running on a hyperconverged solution to be able to manage that, because they can't afford to lose any data or have anything that's corrupt. So that's one of the types of use cases that we would see for video surveillance, and we do have some hyperconverged solutions available around that. As far as test dev workloads, running on multiple infrastructures can make things a little bit more daunting, but for test dev, it's a great use case as well, where we need to deploy VMs and bring VMs down when we're doing a lot of application work. The nice thing about the hyperconverged solution is it has a bit of a quality of service built into it as well, giving you the flexibility of bringing VMs up and or down or removing. And a good example of this is a customer or an app development company who needs to work on specific applications or apps for phones or anything like that, and they would want to spin up VMs quickly and have that agility, so that bringing up a VM doesn't take all day. It's something that can be automated or orchestrated. Next working is probably another, next to VDI, is virtualized production. We all run virtual instances or VMs that are mixed in with our physical infrastructure, but running it on a hyperconverged solution also makes it a little bit easier to deploy VMs and have the ability to migrate workloads from one platform to another. Having a legacy environment moved into a virtual environment, it would work very well on a hyperconverged solution. And typically we see a lot of customers who are more and more virtualized today are tending to lean towards hyperconverged solutions, because they can scale up and add more nodes as they create more and more VMs. A good example for this would be a large telecom customer of ours who was looking for a better solution than the traditional three-tier architecture that they've been running. They're pretty much all virtualized, and they thought that a better solution would be going with HCI for the high availability that was provided by that solution. Remote office and branch office workloads. This is going to be one of those situations where customer doesn't want to put in another three-tier architecture in every single location. Having hyperconverged will give them the ease of management for the deployment of an HCI solution. You can put a single node, a two-node, or even three nodes, depending on the size of the remote office or the remote location. But having the ability to manage it all under one one pane of glass makes that simplicity for them, and also reduces the storage requirements when it comes to being able to move those VMs around, or even the workloads that are there. So a great example of this is a mining company that we were working with. They had multiple sites. Some of them required maybe one node or up to 3 nodes, but they wanted to have the ability to manage it all with one pane of glass, one management console, and know that the reduced infrastructure that was required for each site made it easy for them to go with this type of solution versus deploying another 3-tier architecture and having to manage that all separately with different siloed management tools. Lastly, simplified backup and disaster recovery. Most of our data centers, are split into 2 different ways, in having hardware just for our production environment and then having something for backup and DR. Some of the solutions that we do offer have backup and DR built into it as an offering, so you don't have to add, third-party software or hardware to the backup piece of it. As well as for disaster recovery, we do have cloud solutions built into some of the offerings as well. So giving you that flexibility to move workloads from one location to another as a disaster recovery solution, or being able to back up to this gives you a much more robust option. And some of our customers who are looking at that are using it as a disaster recovery plan, being able to back up to the cloud and being able to recover those VMs if there's a situation where it requires that their site goes down. They'll have the ability to bring up those VMs and put their environment back up and running. So these are just some of them. There are more workloads that do fit, or use cases that fit for customers, databases as well, tier 1 applications. The list can go on and on. The way we would look at it is, what are you currently doing with your environment, and we can assess, would Hyperconverged be a good solution to fit for you and what you're trying to do. And if you feel that one of these types of workloads that John or I mentioned fit what you're trying to do, then maybe we can have a conversation after as to, why would this work best for me, or what are some of the solutions that you've already deployed or have that can help us maybe make the transition and move forward. So as far as this goes, we can move next to the types of, the TCO and ROI as to why Hyperconverged is such a good solution in the monetary aspect, and John will cover that.
Thank you, Pedro. So I'm sure the elephant in the room that we've all been waiting for is, let's discuss the financials of it. If anyone's ever been down the road of a hyperconverged infrastructure, we can see that premiums of 20 to 80%, depending on the configuration, are seen over a similar 3-tiered environment. So, however, apart from the aforementioned operational advantages that we discussed before, you'll see an increased TCO and ROI on your investment for the majority of HCI implementations. We also see a 510% ROI 5 years from the date of purchase, and the payback period with new efficiencies and HCI solution provides 7.5 months, and then from a TCO perspective, we are seeing operational savings of up to 58% over a 5-year period. These are numbers that are in stark opposition with what we would see in a 3-tiered architecture. We see costs rising over time, renewals becoming more and more expensive, performance degradation with added capacity and workloads, and an ROI a third of HCI of an HCI solution, and a TCO double. So essentially, what we're seeing is when we're first acquiring hyperconverged equipment, there's kind of no real way around it. It's going to cost a little bit more than a traditional 3-tiered architecture. Depending on how we scale that out, that's what we're seeing. But if we're just buying our traditional servers, switches, and commodity storage, and we're looking at a hyperconverged solution, the sticker price is going to be a little bit different. Again, with different vendors, sometimes that includes a hypervisor, sometimes that includes backup software, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of variables, but generally when we're looking at hardware to hardware costs, that's what we're seeing. But with the other aforementioned points, we are seeing that you're getting an increased return on investment, and it's actually costing you less over time. So to kind of further that visualization, I have a little bit of an example here that we kind of put out. So this is a customer for VDI Solution, again, not to beat that horse too bad, but it was for 100 virtual instances, and it took up about 40 terabytes. So if we look at it, we see that the capital cost, $175,000 for a 3-tier and about $240 for an HCI. So we are seeing a pretty stark difference. Obviously, it's going to cost a lot more when we first see it. A lot of our customers get a bit of sticker shock on it. I mean, when I first started kind of learning about this stuff and I was understanding how much it cost, I thought the exact same thing. But if we break it down a little bit more, we're seeing the servers are costing about $40K. We're seeing the storage hardware is costing about $145, depending on, I guess, what flavor and what capability you're looking at there. The SAN networking, those are about 20 grand. I mean, unfortunately, if we're looking at redundant Nexus switches from Cisco or something, they're coming in about 10, 12 grand a pop, so I might have been a little light on that numbers. Server virtualization and the software for our hypervisor, about 32K, and professional services about 5 grand. Usually a little bit more than that, but that's kind of average there. We see that kind of collapsed over in the HCI. All of that is kind of baked in, and we're seeing a bit of a different number there. It's coming to about 240. So if we go down a little bit more, though, we see that the operating costs on the HCI side start to get much, much less. I mean, a huge number even there is data center space. I know, you know, $2,000 is nothing that's going to break the bank and kind of help the bottom line too much, but we're seeing that it's about $300 in terms of tile space, in terms of power and cooling, compared to your 3-tiered architecture. If we look at power and cooling just in particular, we're looking at 26K over the year as opposed to 11K, so more than half of that. Post-warranty support, it's not too much different, because I mean, with anything, if it's a production workload, you're going to want to keep that. You're going to want to keep that in support. So obviously, that's something that you're going to need to keep on doing. But if we're kind of looking at it in total, we see the total cost over time. So over about 5 years, we're seeing $482,000 with some change for the 3-tiered architecture, and we're seeing about more than 100K less over that 5 years for the HCI. So we're seeing about a 33% savings. So that's something that's a huge amount of money to be able to open up towards projects, to be able to open up towards different areas of your business, not just kind of sinking it into administrative costs on your data center. So this is just a rough visualization for if you were looking to get one that is particular to what you guys are doing. We can definitely go through that, kind of crunch the numbers and get a little bit more specific, but this was just one that we had done in the past, and it's something that kind of just showed the value. And again, we see the sticker price, yeah, it's more, but over time, you're saving that money. So even that capital cost that you're putting down, you're saving that over time. So we're seeing a huge difference there. So that's one of the things that comes with an HCI solution. But again, I just want to kind of emphasize the fact that comes with a change in the modality in which you are actually running the data center. Because we've had customers before come back and they're like, hey, John, like it didn't really work out like that, but that was because they were taking hyperconverged infrastructure and essentially using it the exact same way they were using their traditional 3-tiered architecture. They weren't taking advantage of the automation of it. They weren't taking advantage of the scalability. They weren't taking advantage of all these tenets that make hyperconverged such a viable solution. So of course, you're not going to see that benefit. You're just going to say, hey, I paid something more for something that does the same thing. But we really have to look at how we're changing the way that we're actually operating within our data centers to really kind of get this value. But you know, I think it's pretty easy to do, and we know that kind of going into it. That's something that we see happen with a lot of customers. So moving on from the TCO and ROI, I want to talk about some of the HCI partners that we feel are kind of the strongest players in the field. So we have Nutanix, VxRail from our friends over at Dell EMC, Scale Computing, and HPE's SimpliVity. So there is not one pure leader that I would say, you know what, this one is better than all the rest. This one, this one's a bottom feeder. We don't want to kind of look at that. They're all great for different use cases, different customer interactions, and you know what, a lot of it comes with your preference in terms of Who do you like support from? If you're an existing Dell EMC customer, you've had a great relationship with them, then yeah, we're going to look towards a VxRail, but we're going to make sure that from a technical perspective, it's going to hit everything you want, because they're all great products, but they all have their different, it's called nuances that make them the best fit for the customer. So just kind of go through a few of the different aspects of it. So if we're looking at Nutanix, we see that they are hypervisor agnostic, and they also have something called AHV, which is Acropolis Hypervisor, as proprietary. So a Nutanix cluster is able to run on either VMware, Hyper-V, or Acropolis Hypervisor. Something that's a little bit different, and we'll get into that a little bit later, is that Nutanix actually has a Acropolis single pane of glass. When we're looking at VxRail and we're looking at SimpliVity, Scale's another one with a single pane of glass, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but if we're looking at the other two, they are largely run on a vCenter with some management features on there. So again, that's not really one is better than the other. We have tons of customers who have been using vCenter and vSphere for years and years, and that is a better option for them than trying to learn a new interface from Nutanix using Prism and using Acropolis. So but that is one of the tenets of Nutanix that a lot of our customers like. And when we have the proprietary hypervisor, that's often something that, when we have customers who aren't married to Hyper-V and aren't married to VMware, they see Acropolis, and it's a pretty feature-rich hypervisor, and then that cuts down on all their hypervisor costs and their virtualization costs. So that's something that we see a lot of success with. But if we're looking at VxRail, we see VMware only. So we think VMware only, oh, hey, like it's missing a couple of options. We can't use Hyper-V, but because we all know that VMware owns Dell owns VMware, I can never get it straight. It changes all the time, but we see a strong integration with VMware into VxRail. You're still using vCenter, you're still using vSphere, but we're having added management features that are fully integrated and kind of push that envelope forward when you're using VMware. It is made with VMware in mind, made for VMware, so it's a very strong candidate. And obviously, you have the tried and true hardware from Dell EMC with their PowerEdge servers, so we know that we're having a strong hardware play on that as well. Moving on to Scale, that's one where we can only use a KVM hypervisor. So again, sometimes we look at that and it seems like a bit of a devaluation of what Scale can do, but I think it's really a strong suit in some places. So we're looking at KVM, it's the most widely deployed hypervisor on Earth. It is open source. It's kind of got the best of both worlds. And if you are to see the interface that we're looking, which is called HC3 from Scale, it's very easy to use, and it's very strong in how we're using the hypervisor. So in my personal opinion, I don't see any kind of limitations unless we've already sunk huge amounts of money into VMware, or we're really into the way VMware is, or Hyper-V, then it's sometimes not an option. But if we're kind of a little bit more open with that, then I always think Scale is a very viable option, even compared with Nutanix, VxRail, and SimpliVity. If we're looking at SimpliVity, we're hypervisor agnostic. So they don't have their own proprietary hypervisor, but they are able to use VMware and Hyper-V. I will note that right now it is pretty much only VMware. Hyper-V is, I believe it's coming general availability in the near future. They're still kind of working out some kinks, so I mean that might be a little bit far off until we're able to kind of see some tried and true experiences from our customers with it. But I mean, in terms of using VMware, it works great. Again, it runs off vCenter and VMware, and it's something that a lot of our VMware customers have had a lot of success with. So kind of moving down the line, if we look at Nutanix, VxRail, and Scale, those are RAIN. So when I was talking about a little bit before, when we were talking about the VDI solution, that's where we get that N-1 redundancy. So RAIN, redundant array of independent nodes, as opposed to the traditional RAID. So that is not necessarily a bad thing, because if we're looking at a hyperconverged option with all SSD, again, we're not really going to lose disk anyway. So having a RAID level is somewhat redundant, but there are some advantages of having both RAID and RAID. So that's when we look at SimpliVity. So from a data from a data protection point of view, we're able to lose either 1 or 2 disks, depending on if we do RAID 5 or 6, and we're able to lose a node. Another flexibility that we have is when we are configuring these solutions. Again, when I was mentioning before that we usually start off with a 3-node architecture. For simplicity, it's often viable to have the same data protection but only have 2 nodes because we're now using RAID as the fault tolerance as opposed to RAID. So, I mean, that's usually kind of up to what the customers feel comfortable with, but I mean, we've had great success with both, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. Again, if we're looking at all-flash solutions, this hardly ever fails, so that's not something that's a huge concern. SimpliVity is only all-flash. We're not able to do spinning disk in there, so I mean, the likelihood of their disk failing is even less. In the other solutions, we are able to have spinning disks, but again, when we have RAID level protection, we are seeing, we don't see any data loss. We're always having kind of data and our performance up to snuff. So again, I talked a little bit about the different management interfaces. So for Scale and Nutanix, we see a single pane of glass, and for VxRail and SimpliVity, it's very much hypervisor based. One thing that I want to mention about SimpliVity is that we do get a full backup cycle implemented within it. So there's use of that with the hardware accelerator storage controller. So that's able to kind of facilitate things like backup and snapshots and replication without kind of putting strain on the CPUs. And, you know, whenever I kind of mention that and I show this slide, it seems like, oh, well, it's a clear winner. Like, it's got this. But there is a distinct overhead, and there is also a price kind of premium that comes with that. So enabled to facilitate the storage accelerator card, enabled to facilitate all these extra actions and kind of extra features, we do see a larger overhead from a software perspective and a larger overhead from an allocation of resources just to kind of running the box and not to your production workloads. So it often does kind of push the price up. So again, there's pros and cons and there's nuances to each of our big partners, but that's when, you know, as Pedro kind of discussed, we look at the solution and which one is going to work best for you from a technology perspective. You know, which one is going to make the business outcomes a reality by going with a certain vendor. One last thing I just want to kind of mention is that when we're looking at what hardware it's on, so we talk about how it's a software-defined solution, but it's got to run on something, right? So when we look at Nutanix, there's a huge flexibility in the amount of hardware we can put on. Nutanix is slowly moving towards being a software company as opposed to a hardware company. You can still get their OEM hardware from Supermicro with the Nutanix box, as the one you guys see on the slide right there, but you can also put it on HP DL380 servers. You can put it on PowerEdge servers from Dell, and you can put it on Cisco servers. So you kind of, you have that flexibility, but I also just want to kind of put out there Nutanix, like vSAN, when we're talking about a software-based hyperconverged, 9 times out of 10, I would say almost 10 times out of 10, you're not going to be able to provision your old existing hardware and just buy the software, so to speak. That's not something that, it never works out like that. We're often have to provision that hardware specifically for a hyperconverged environment, and I mean, I doubt that many customers out there have this in mind. And, you know, maybe people future thinking, I don't want to step on anyone's toes, but it very rarely works out like that. So I just want to kind of keep that in mind. For VxRail, we are, you can only run it on Dell hardware, but there also is Dell Ready nodes where we can run vSAN on there. So it's a little bit different than VxRail, but somewhat within the same family. Scale is OEM and Dell hardware, but I did just hear news that you are also soon going to be able to buy it on Lenovo hardware as well, and that's a choice. But I think for right now, we're just kind of running full steam ahead with the Dell hardware, and then SimpliVity. Back before they were bought by HP, we were able to put it on Cisco hardware, put on HP hardware, but now it is only HP hardware. So that's a bit of vendor lock in there, but that's just a quick overview of the difference between some of our top partners there. But obviously we can get more into that if we get on a call and we discuss. We can give you kind of more in-depth demos and a little bit more differences, but that's just a little bit of food for thought to chew on when we're kind of trying to sort out the differences. So just moving on, one thing I'd like to talk about is, when is HCI not the right fit? I know we've been talking for the last 40 minutes or so about how it's, you know, the latest and greatest, in which there is a lot of virtue to it. There's a lot of workloads that we discussed that are definitely right for HCI, but it's not right for everyone. It's not the, you know, it's not the second coming. We're not seeing that it's just working for everything. So when we look at high IOPS and low latency workloads, sometimes it's not the best for that. We can provision it in a way that it is, but we often see a price premium when we're looking at that. And we're not talking about regular production workloads, VMs, and things like that. We're talking about very resource-heavy workloads, and some of our vendors were even able to get ones with GPUs involved, so we can run things like Photoshop and AutoCAD and things like that. But if we're looking for something very, very heavy, Hyperconverged is often not the right fit yet. I think that there'll be advancements in the platforms where we can kind of bridge that gap, but if we're looking at something very high performance, we're still looking at our traditional storage arrays, such as like 3PAR and Extreme IO and things of that nature. Secondly, high capacity environments can somewhat be cost prohibitive. So we understand that an HCI environment is built upon x86 servers. We only have so many drive slots in there. So in order to scale out capacity to, we're talking about, 200 terabytes, 400 terabytes, up to petabytes, then we're having to scale out those clusters with a huge amount of nodes. And with that, we need to license software with it, we need to allocate processor, we need to allocate storage, so that can get costly. I mean, there are definitely situations where customers have done that. I mean, I can name one because it's in the States, so obviously we personally aren't working about it, but the federal government has over 14,000 nodes of Nutanix in the United States there. So, I mean, obviously it can be done. That's, not everybody is the federal government of the United States of America, but it can happen. So, I mean, yeah, high capacity workloads, that's something that we're somewhat weary of, but again, we have workarounds for it, but it's just something to kind of look at. Non-virtualized environments, I'll just kind of throw it out there. We don't have many customers that are completely non-virtualized. Oftentimes we find someone who will have some sort of bare metal server doing something or other. A lot of the vendors can integrate one bare metal server or a few physical workloads into their environment, but they're not going to really work the greatest. It's not going to be ideal. So if you're a customer with a non-virtualized environment, HCI is not really going to be the right fit. And then just other certain specialized workloads, like when we have infrastructure that is purpose-built for specific applications, sometimes Hyperconverged isn't the best fit for that, especially if you're running other production workloads off of it. But again, for certain specialized workloads, it does work. So if we look at BDI and things like that, yeah, we have clusters specifically made for that and what we're doing for it. But I just mean kind of spreading things a little thin is what we don't want when we're talking about specialized workloads. So, lastly, I'm going to hand it back over to Pedro, and he's going to discuss a little bit how myself and himself kind of as architects vet solutions for you and how we have the services to kind of put that together.
Thanks, John. So we do have quite a large team here at CDW. Aside from just the Hyperconverged part of it, we do have specialists as far as networking specialists, storage specialists, software specialists. So we have dedicated and knowledgeable resources here that can help you define what type of solution you're going to need for your environment. But for today's specific case, typically what we would do is an introductory call to understand what the business requirements are and what are the challenges that you're looking to fix. So we want to get as much information of what your current environment looks like, what you're currently using, what you're doing with it, and then we can start working as far as putting a plan together to look at what types of solutions will work best for you. Typically, we'll run an assessment on your environment to see how your current environment runs, where the performance points are, and then that way we can understand what type of solution will work best for you. But not just on the assessment, we would also talk to you about what are you looking for as far as key features. Specifically in Hyperconverged, there's a lot of software features that are provided by some of the top vendors, Nutanix, VMware, just to name a couple of them. They do have more features outside of just the HCI piece of it. They do have a lot of analytics tools and networking tools to help with like microsegmentation. So these are some other features that may or may not be a good fit for you, but we can talk about those things and figure out, is that something that you'll need? Another challenge sometimes too is on the software piece. Most customers don't know that software does cost a little bit of money, and what's usually offered or described by the vendors is, you know, you get the software with it, but is that exactly all the software you need? So we're here to help you make those calls and understand what's going to work best for you.